Section 17 of Sophisms of the Protectionists. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Sophisms of the Protectionists by Frédéric Bastiat. Translated by Horace White. Section 17. 16. The right and the left hand. Report to the King. Sire, when we see these men of the Libre Exchange audaciously disseminating their doctrines, and maintaining that the right of buying and selling is implied by that of ownership, a piece of insolence that M. Billaud has criticized like a true lawyer, we may be allowed to entertain serious fears as to the destiny of national labor. For what will Frenchmen do with their arms and intelligences when they are free? The ministry which you have honored with your confidence has naturally paid great attention to so serious a subject, and has sought in its wisdom for a protection which might be substituted for that which appears compromised. It proposes to you to forbid your faithful subjects the use of the right hand. Sire, do not wrong us so far as to think that we lightly adopted a measure which, at the first glance, may appear odd. Deep study of the protective system has revealed to us this syllogism, on which it entirely rests: the more one labors, the richer one is. The more difficulties one has to conquer, the more one labors. Ergo, the more difficulties one has to conquer, the richer one is. What is protection really, but an ingenious application of this formal reasoning, which is so compact that it would resist the subtlety of M. Billaud himself? Let us personify the country. Let us look on it as a collective being, with 30,000,000 mouths, and consequently 60,000,000 arms. This being makes a clock, which he proposes to exchange in Belgium for 10 quintals of iron. But, we say to him, make the iron yourself. I cannot, says he, it would take me too much time, and I could not make 5 quintals while I can make 1 clock. Utopist, we reply, for this very reason we forbid your making the clock, and order you to make the iron. Do not you see that we create your labor? Sire, it will not have escaped your sagacity, that it is just as if we said to the country, labor with the left hand, and not with the right. The creation of obstacles to furnish labor an opportunity to develop itself, is the principle of the restriction which is dying. It is also the principle of the restriction which is about to be created. Sire, to make such regulations is not to innovate, but to preserve. The efficacy of the measure is incontestable. It is difficult, much more difficult than one thinks, to do with the left hand what one was accustomed to do with the right. You will convince yourself of it, sire, if you will condescend to try our system on something which is familiar to you, like shuffling cards, for instance. We can then flatter ourselves that we have opened an illimitable career to labor. When workmen of all kinds are reduced to their left hands, consider, sire, the immense number that will be required to meet the present consumption, supposing it to be invariable, which we always do when we compare differing systems of production. So prodigious a demand for manual labor cannot fail to bring about a considerable increase in wages, and pauperism will disappear from the country as if by enchantment. Sire, your paternal heart will rejoice at the thought that the benefits of this regulation will extend over that interesting portion of the great family whose fate excites your liveliest solicitude. What is the destiny of women in France? That sex which is the boldest and most hardened to fatigue is insensibly driving them all from fields of labor. Formerly they found a refuge in the lottery offices. These have been closed by a pitiless philanthropy. And under what pretext? To save, said they, the money of the poor. Alas! has a poor man ever obtained from a piece of money enjoyments as sweet and innocent as those which the mysterious urn of fortune contained for him? Cut off from all the sweets of life, how many delicious hours did he introduce into the bosom of his family, when, every 2 weeks, he put the value of a day's labor on a quatern? Hope had always her place at the domestic hearth. The garret was peopled with illusions. The wife promised herself that she would eclipse her neighbors with the splendor of her attire. The son saw himself drum major, and the daughter felt herself carried towards the altar in the arms of her betrothed. To have a beautiful dream is certainly something. The lottery was the poetry of the poor, and we have allowed it to escape them. The lottery dead, what means have we of providing for our protégés? Tobacco and the postal service. Tobacco, certainly. It progresses, thanks to Heaven, and the distinguished habits which august examples have been enabled to introduce among our elegant youth. But the postal service! We will say nothing of that, but make it the subject of a special report. Then what is left to your female subjects except tobacco? Nothing, except embroidery, knitting, and sewing, pitiful resources, which are more and more restricted by that barbarous science, mechanics. But as soon as your ordinance has appeared, as soon as the right hands are cut off or tied up, everything will change face. 20, 30 times more embroiderers, washers and ironers, seamstresses and shirt makers, would not meet the consumption (honi soit qui mal y pense) of the kingdom, always assuming that it is invariable, according to our way of reasoning. It is true that this supposition might be denied by cold-blooded theorists, for dresses and shirts would be dearer, but they say the same thing of the iron which France gets from our mines, compared to the vintage it could get on our hillsides. This argument can, therefore, be no more entertained against left-handedness than against protection, for this very dearness is the result and the sign of the excess of efforts and of labors, which is precisely the basis on which, in one case as in the other, we claim to found the prosperity of the working classes. Yes, we make a touching picture of the prosperity of the sewing business. What movement! What activity! What life! Each dress will busy 100 fingers instead of 10. No longer will there be an idle young girl. And we need not, sire, point out to your perspicacity the moral results of this great revolution. Not only will there be more women employed, but each one of them will earn more, for they cannot meet the demand, and if competition still shows itself, it will no longer be among the working women who make the dresses, but the beautiful ladies who wear them. You see, sire, that our proposition is not only conformable to the economic traditions of the government, but it is also essentially moral and democratic. To appreciate its effect, let us suppose it realized. Let us transport ourselves in thought into the future. Let us imagine the system in action for 20 years. Idleness is banished from the country. Ease and concord, contentment and morality, have entered all families together with labor. There is no more misery and no more prostitution. The left hand being very clumsy at its work, there is a superabundance of labor, and the pay is satisfactory. Everything is based on this, and, as a consequence, the workshops are filled. Is it not true, sire, that if Utopians were to suddenly demand the freedom of the right hand, they would spread alarm throughout the country? Is it not true that this pretended reform would overthrow all existences? Then our system is good, since it cannot be overthrown without causing great distress. However, we have a sad presentiment that some day, so great is the perversity of man, an association will be organized to secure the liberty of right hands. It seems to us that we already hear these free right-handers speak as follows in the Salle Montesquieu: People, you believe yourselves richer because they have taken from you one hand. You see but the increase of labor which results to you from it. But look also at the dearness it causes, and the forced decrease in the consumption of all articles. This measure has not made capital, which is the source of wages, more abundant. The waters which flow from this great reservoir are directed into other channels. The quantity is not increased, and the definite result is, for the nation, as a whole, a loss of comfort equal to the excess of the production of several millions of right hands, over several millions of left hands. Then let us form a league, and at the expense of some inevitable disturbances, let us conquer the right of working with both hands. Happily, sire, there will be organized an association for the defense of left-handed labor, and the Sinistrists will have no trouble in reducing to nothing all these generalities and realities, suppositions and abstractions, reveries and utopias. They need only to exhume the Moniteur Industriel of 1846, and they will find, ready-made, arguments against free trade, which destroy so admirably this liberty of the right hand, that all that is required is to substitute one word for another. The Parisian Free Trade League never doubted but that it would have the assistance of the working men. But the working men can no longer be led by the nose. They have their eyes open, and they know political economy better than our diplomaed professors. Free trade, they replied, will take from us our labor, and labor is our real, great, sovereign property. With labor, with much labor, the price of articles of merchandise is never beyond reach. But without labor, even if bread should cost but a penny a pound, the workingman is compelled to die of hunger. Now, your doctrines, instead of increasing the amount of labor in France, diminish it. That is to say, you reduce us to misery. Number of October 13, 1846. It is true that when there are too many manufactured articles to sell, their price falls. But as wages decrease, when these articles sink in value, the result is that instead of being able to buy them, we can buy nothing. Thus, when they are cheapest, the workingman is most unhappy. Gautier de Rumilly, Moniteur Industriel, of November 17. It would not be ill for the Sinistrists to mingle some threats with their beautiful theories. This is a sample. What! To desire to substitute the labor of the right hand for that of the left, and thus to cause a forced reduction, if not an annihilation of wages, the sole resource of almost the entire nation! And this at the moment when poor harvests already impose painful sacrifices on the working man, disquiet him as to his future, and make him more accessible to bad counsels, and ready to abandon the wise course of conduct he had hitherto adhered to. We are confident, sire, that thanks to such wise reasonings, if a struggle takes place, the left hand will come out of it victorious. Perhaps also an association will be formed in order to ascertain whether the right and the left hand are not both wrong, and if there is not a third hand between them in order to conciliate all. After having described the dexterists as seduced by the apparent liberality of a principle, the correctness of which has not yet been verified by experience, and the Sinistrists as encamping in the position they have gained, it will say, and yet they deny that there is a third course to pursue in the midst of the conflict, and they do not see that the working classes have to defend themselves, at the same moment, against those who wish to change nothing in the present situation, because they find their advantage in it, and against those who dream of an economic revolution, of which they have calculated neither the extent nor the significance. National of October 16. We do not desire, however, to hide from your Majesty the fact that our plan has a vulnerable side. They may say to us, in 20 years all left hands will be as skilled as right ones are now, and you can no longer count on left-handedness to increase the national labor. We reply to this, that according to learned physicians, the left side of the body has a natural weakness, which is very reassuring for the future of labor. Finally, sire, consent to sign the law, and a great principle will have prevailed. All wealth comes from the intensity of labor. It will be easy for us to extend it, and vary its application. We will declare, for instance, that it shall be allowable to work only with the feet, This is no more impossible, for there have been instances, than to extract iron from the mud of the Seine. There have even been men who wrote with their backs. You see, sire, that we do not lack means of increasing national labor. If they do begin to fail us, there remains the boundless resource of amputation. If this report, sire, was not intended for publication, we would call your attention to the great influence which systems analogous to the one we submit to you are capable of giving to men in power. But this is a subject which we reserve for consideration in private council. 17. Supremacy by labor. As in a time of war, supremacy is attained by superiority in arms, can in a time of peace supremacy be secured by superiority in labor? This question is of the greatest interest at a time when no one seems to doubt that in the field of industry, as on that of battle, the stronger crushes the weaker. This must result from the discovery of some sad and discouraging analogy between labor, which exercises itself on things, and violence, which exercises itself on men. For how could these two things be identical in their effects if they were opposed in their nature? And if it is true that in manufacturing as in war, supremacy is the necessary result of superiority, why need we occupy ourselves with progress or social economy, since we are in a world where all has been so arranged by Providence that one and the same result, oppression, necessarily flows from the most antagonistic principles? Referring to the new policy toward which commercial freedom is drawing England, many persons make this objection, which, I admit, occupies the sincerest minds. Is England doing anything more than pursuing the same end by different means? Does she not constantly aspire to universal supremacy? Sure of the superiority of her capital and labor, does she not call in free competition to stifle the industry of the continent, reign as a sovereign, and conquer the privilege of feeding and clothing the ruined peoples? It would be easy for me to demonstrate that these alarms are chimerical, that our pretended inferiority is greatly exaggerated, that all our great branches of industry not only resist foreign competition, but develop themselves under its influence, and that its infallible effect is to bring about an increase in general consumption capable of absorbing both foreign and domestic products. Today I desire to attack this objection directly, leaving it all its power and the advantage of the ground it has chosen. Putting English and French on one side, I will try to find out in a general way, if, even though by superiority in one branch of industry, one nation has crushed out similar industrial pursuits in another one, this nation has made a step toward supremacy, and that one toward dependence. In other words, if both do not gain by the operation, and if the conquered do not gain the most by it. If we see in any product but a cause of labor, it is certain that the alarm of the Protectionists is well founded. If we consider iron, for instance, only in connection with the masters of forges, it might be feared that the competition of a country where iron was a gratuitous gift of nature would extinguish the furnaces of another country where oil and fuel were scarce. But is this a complete view of the subject? Are there relations only between iron and those who make it? Has it none with those who use it? Is its definite and only destination to be produced? And if it is useful, not on account of the labor which it causes, but on account of the qualities which it possesses, and the numerous services for which its hardness and malleability fit it, does it not follow that foreigners cannot reduce its price, even so far as to prevent its production among us, without doing us more good, under the last statement of the case, than it injures us under the first? Please consider well that there are many things which foreigners, owing to the natural advantages which surround them, hinder us from producing directly, and in regard to which we are placed, in reality, in the hypothetical position which we examined relative to iron. We produce at home neither tea, coffee, gold, nor silver. Does it follow that our labor as a whole is thereby diminished? No. Only to create the equivalent of these things, to acquire them by way of exchange, we detach from our general labor a smaller portion than we would require to produce them ourselves. More remains to us to use for other things. We are so much the richer and stronger. All that external rivalry can do, even in cases where it absolutely keeps us from any certain form of labor, is to encourage our labor and increase our productive power. Is that the road to supremacy for foreigners? If a mine of gold were to be discovered in France, it does not follow that it would be for our interests to work it. It is even certain that the enterprise ought to be neglected, if each ounce of gold absorbed more of our labor than an ounce of gold bought in Mexico with cloth. In this case, it would be better to keep on seeing our mines in our manufactories. What is true of gold is true of iron. The illusion comes from the fact that one thing is not seen. That is, that foreign superiority prevents national labor only under some certain form, and makes it superfluous under this form, but by putting at our disposal the very result of the labor thus annihilated. If men lived in diving bells under the water, and had to provide themselves with air by the use of pumps, there would be an immense source of labor. To destroy this labor, leaving men in this condition, would be to do them a terrible injury. But if labor ceases because the necessity for it has gone, because men are placed in another position, where air reaches their lungs without an effort, then the loss of this labor is not to be regretted, except in the eyes of those who appreciate in labor only the labor itself. It is exactly this sort of labor which machines, commercial freedom, and progress of all sorts, gradually annihilate. Not useful labor, but labor which has become superfluous, supernumerary, objectless, and without result. On the other hand, protection restores it to activity. It replaces us under the water, so as to give us an opportunity of pumping. It forces us to ask for gold from the inaccessible national mine, rather than from our national manufactories. All its effect is summed up in this phrase, loss of power. It must be understood that I speak here of general effects, and not of the temporary disturbances occasioned by the transition from a bad to a good system. A momentary disarrangement necessarily accompanies all progress. This may be a reason for making the transition a gentle one, but not for systematically interdicting all progress, and still less for misunderstanding it. They represent industry to us as a conflict. This is not true, or is true only when you confine yourself to considering each branch of industry in its effects on some similar branch, in isolating both in the mind from the rest of humanity. But there is something else. There are its effects on consumption, and the general well-being. This is the reason why it is not allowable to assimilate labor to war as they do. In war, the strongest overwhelms the weakest. In labor, the strongest gives strength to the weakest. This radically destroys the analogy. Though the English are strong and skilled, possess immense invested capital, and have at their disposal the two great powers of production, iron and fire, all this is converted into the cheapness of the product. And who gains by the cheapness of the product? He who buys it. It is not in their power to absolutely annihilate any portion of our labor. All that they can do is to make it superfluous through some result acquired, to give air at the same time that they suppress the pump, to increase thus the force at our disposal, and, which is a remarkable thing, to render their pretended supremacy more impossible, as their superiority becomes more undeniable. Thus, by a rigorous and consoling demonstration, we reach this conclusion. that labor and violence, so opposed in their nature, are, whatever socialists and protectionists may say, no less so in their effects. All we required to do that was to distinguish between annihilated labor and economized labor. Having less iron because one works less, or having more iron although one works less, are things which are more than different. They are opposites. The protectionists confound them, we do not. That is all. Be convinced of one thing. If the English bring into play much activity, labor, capital, intelligence, and natural force, it is not for the love of us. It is to give themselves many comforts in exchange for their products. They certainly desire to receive at least as much as they give, and they make at home the payment for that which they buy elsewhere. If, then, they inundate us with their products, it is because they expect to be inundated with ours. In this case, the best way to have much for ourselves is to be free to choose between these two methods of production, direct production or indirect production. All the British Machiavellism cannot lead us to make a bad choice. Let us then stop assimilating industrial competition with war, a false assimilation, which is specious only when two rival branches of industry are isolated, in order to judge of the effects of competition. As soon as the effect produced on the general well-being is taken into consideration, the analogy disappears. In a battle, he who is killed is thoroughly killed, and the army is weakened just that much. In manufactures, one manufactory succumbs only so far as the total of national labor replaces what it produced, with an excess. Imagine a state of affairs where for one man, stretched on the plain, two spring up full of force and vigor. If there is a planet where such things happen, it must be admitted that war is carried on there under conditions so different from those which obtain here below, that it does not even deserve that name. Now this is the distinguishing character of what they have so inappropriately called an industrial war. Let the Belgians and the English reduce the price of their iron, if they can, and keep on reducing it until they bring it down to nothing. They may thereby put out one of our furnaces, kill one of our soldiers. But I defy them to hinder 1,000 other industries, more profitable than the disabled one, immediately, and as a necessary consequence of this very cheapness, resuscitating and developing themselves. Let us decide that supremacy by labor is impossible and contradictory, since all superiority which manifests itself among a people is converted into cheapness, and results only in giving force to all others. Let us, then, banish from political economy all these expressions borrowed from the vocabulary of battles: to struggle with equal arms, to conquer, to crush out, to stifle, to be beaten, invasion, tribute. What do these words mean? Squeeze them and nothing comes out of them. We are mistaken. There come from them absurd errors and fatal prejudices. These are the words which stop the blending of peoples, their peaceful, universal, indissoluble alliance, and the progress of humanity. End of section 17. Recording by Katie Riley, May 2010.